It's time for another edition of Fab's Fantasy Facts. I'm Jennifer Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and I'm bringing in the expert himself, Michael Fabiano, our senior fantasy analyst at Sports Illustrated. Fabs, I love these little nuggets you pull out for us. They make it a lot easier for drafting next year and also help us feel good about how our seasons went this year. And you've got your eye on a certain AFC quarterback. We all know that AFC, it is going to be competitive for many years to come. But you want to focus on a specific quarterback from Los Angeles.
And then Justin Herbert. He finished second in fantasy points among quarterbacks this past season, 380.8 points. That's pretty good, right? And he now holds the record for the most fantasy points scored by a quarterback in his first two seasons at 713.6. He surpassed Cam Newton, who held the record at 693.8 in his first two seasons with the Carolina Panthers. Justin Herbert moving up. He's a top 3 quarterback for next season.
Now, if you were a waiver wire warrior at the end of this season, you may have collected some points from the Sun God. And those of us in Dynasty Leagues are particularly interested in a certain wide receiver from Detroit.
Yeah, the fact that you got out waiver wire warrior was pretty impressive, my friend. And let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? In his first 11 games, he kind of was non-existent from a fantasy perspective, right? I mean, he ranked 62nd in fantasy points. He averaged 4.7 targets, 3.5 catches, and 32 yards a game. He also didn't score a touchdown. And then, I don't know what happened, but in the last 6 games, St. Brown ranked second in fantasy points among wide receivers. He averaged 11.2 targets, 8.5 catches, nearly 94 yards, and had 5 touchdowns. The lone wide receiver with more fantasy points in that 6-game stretch was Cooper Kupp, who had the best season of all time among wide receivers based on fantasy points. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, his draft stock for 2022, certainly on the rise. He's going to be a top 50 pick next season.
Yeah, he's a fantastic player. I'm excited for his future. Now, the next player on your list, a lot of questions surrounding. We now know his coach has resigned. We don't know who his quarterback is going to be. Lots of questions. But what is important to focus on when we're looking at Alvin Kamara?
Right. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, right? Remember in 2020, he was the best running back in fantasy football. He had 21 total touchdowns. He scored nearly 380 fantasy points. Unfortunately, his numbers really went down. And I think we kind of predicted that, right? I wrote a column about the fantasy case against Alvin Kamara back in the preseason. And unfortunately, it came to fruition. He scored only 235 points. He averaged 7.1 points per game fewer than he did in 2020. The touchdowns went down and the receptions really went down. He had 67 targets and 47 catches. This is the first time in his career in the National Football League that he's had fewer than 81 catches. And this was also the first year he played without Drew Brees. That was a problem. And as you mentioned, we're unsure of what the coaching staff will be for the Saints. We're unsure about the quarterback situation next season. Kamara is still a first-round pick in fantasy, but he comes with more questions than he normally would because he's been a fantasy star for most of his career.
The next player on your list is someone that some of us thought might have a sophomore slump after he blew out records by Anquan Boldin in his freshman season in the league, but it didn't quite turn out that way. So what did you find out about Justin Jefferson?
He's been tremendous, right? I mean, boy, these LSU wide receivers are unbelievable.
Yeah.
He was even better in his second season than he was an NFL freshman, and he had a record-breaking season in his first campaign. He has recorded a combined 604.6 fantasy points in his first 2 seasons in the National Football League. That ranks second all-time among wide receivers behind Odell Beckham Jr. Oh, by the way, another LSU wide receiver. Jefferson also tied Michael Thomas for the most catches in his first 2 years in the National Football League and set a record with 3,016 receiving yards that eclipsed OBJ's previous mark of 2,755. Justin Jefferson is going to be one of the elite wide receivers in fantasy football for a long, long time. And Jen, he proved that his rookie campaign was certainly no fluke.
Absolutely. He is just phenomenal. I know there's lots of questions going on there in Minnesota, some coaching changes. There's questions as to whether or not they will stick with Kirk Cousins, but Justin Jefferson seems like doesn't matter. He's just that darn good. And then finally, let's wrap this up with the king himself. Yeah, he only had about half a season worth of games, but then he came back in the postseason, looked pretty frisky for a guy that's 250 pounds coming back from foot surgery. What kind of nuggets did you dig up on Derrick Henry?
Derrick Henry was on pace to potentially be the first running back to ever rush for 2,000 yards in back-to-back seasons. He rushed for 937 yards and 10 touchdowns in the 8 games before he got hurt. His pace would have been 1,991 rushing yards, only 9 yards short of 2,000. I think he probably would have done it. He was just that hot, and he was getting a massive volume in terms of the touch share in that Titans backfield. And although he missed more than half the season, Jen, he still finished as the RB22 in PPR leagues, and he scored more fantasy points, get this, than James Robinson and Saquon Barkley, and those guys both played at least 13 games. So Derrick Henry could have had an historic season, another historic season from a real football and fantasy football perspective. Looking ahead to 2022, I have him ranked as my #2 running back behind Jonathan Taylor.
Wow. So you do have faith in the aging running back. I do. I think he's extraordinary. And those numbers that you mentioned, if he has stayed on pace, and of course, you never know, but his on pace numbers actually would have had him more than 150 more rushing yards than Jonathan Taylor, who's now in the conversation for Offensive Player of the Year alongside Cooper Kupp. So that is how phenomenal Derrick Henry has been. Could be. You're saying he still can be next year, which I absolutely love. You guys, if you want to check out more of Michael Fabiano's fantasy facts, head over to si.com/fantasy.